Prometheus. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about monitoring Kubernetes with Prometheus. Just a show of hands, who knows what Prometheus is? Oh, this is awesome. This is great. You guys should be teaching this. I should be doing this. Who runs Prometheus in production workloads? You guys? Okay, great. Who runs into scaling issues? Okay. See, we might get something about this. A little bit about me. I work at Logs.io, which we're a full cloud observability platform built on open source tooling. So things like hosted Grafana, OpenSearch, and Jaeger. I'm not here to plug up the company, however, just want to let you know. I love photography, watch a lot of movies, father of 4 dogs. Here's my dogs. The pug one was funny. So just agenda today, I'm going to give a little bit about, just because I don't know if everyone knows what Prometheus is, so I just want to give a little bit of an introduction there. And then kind of how does Prometheus and Kubernetes work together. I'm going to give you a demo of running the Prometheus stack. And then best practices in scaling, because if you run into scaling issues, they can be kind of a pest, right? So let's start with like what even is monitoring, right? This is kind of its formal definition where I've seen it, which is the process of using telemetry data exposed by tools to watch the performance of applications and services. Really, all monitoring is, right, is you're getting data in from various sources, you're being alerted on it, you're visualizing it so you can track trends, be notified when things are going wrong, and make your life a heck of a lot easier. So that's what I do in terms of the day-to-day. I help customers kind of achieve that journey. And these are kind of the telemetry types that you guys might see in a day-to-day, right? Logs, metrics, and traces when we talk about Prometheus. Yep. Question?
Do you differentiate between monitoring and observability, or do you use them interchangeably?
They can be. I've heard people use them interchangeably, but I think observability I think monitoring was sort of an older term. Observability is definitely more common nowadays in terms of what I hear around the industry and with my customers. So a lot of application performance monitoring, trying to understand where bottlenecks are within your application, as well as alerting and visualizing, right? I think it's kind of all encompassing, and it's definitely a journey, right? I think like people think that, hey, I just send this data in, it's all good. It's not really the case, right? Like you gotta keep up with it. You gotta make sure you know what you're sending in, because this stuff is not cheap, right? Telemetry data isn't cheap, especially log data. In terms of resources, in terms of money, right? I'm sure you guys run into it. It's expensive stuff. But really when we talk about the telemetry data today, Prometheus is really talking about metrics. Now, what is a time series? I know I don't, by the show of hands, I don't really have to explain this, but essentially we got, right, we have a metric, and this is the name of a metric, and then we have our labels. And we're going to talk a little bit about cardinality. I'm not sure if anyone's ran into issues with cardinality before. Yeah, my man. So, yeah, these are essentially labels, right, and this is what makes a time series unique, followed by the timestamp, and then what the actual value of that metric is, right? And that's essentially a timestamp at its core, and this is what Prometheus format looks like. So, what is Prometheus? Open source time series database created in 2012 by SoundCloud to assist in monitoring and alerting. The good news is it's CNCF backed, so I don't think it's going anywhere. It seems like more and more vendors are integrating with it. I don't see it dying down, it's only getting more popular. It works on a pull model, so in order to scrape targets, scrape applications, scrape services, Kubernetes, right, it runs on this kind of pull model. And then it uses its own query language, PromQL. Who likes PromQL and who does not? Show of hands, who does not like PromQL? Oh my god, that's interesting. Who likes it? Wow, okay. Yeah, I kind of agree. It's a little bit, it's a steep learning curve, I should say. Okay, so this is kind of like a Prometheus architecture, right? So we have our application, we have our exporter, which are third parties. So maybe you're running something like Mongo databases or MySQL. There's exporters for all these stuff, right? And all these technologies. And then you have your application. Maybe you're running a Flask app. Maybe you're running a Go application, Java application, so forth, right? So Prometheus is kind of essential. And what it allows you to do is actually pull that data or scrape it from that target. So your exporter or your application would be your target. And then obviously if we look up, we see service discovery. And if you run Prometheus in context of Kubernetes, you're probably pretty familiar with service discovery because it pretty much automatically pulls targets. And it uses something called service monitors, which you'll probably see in the demo. We're going to talk about a little bit about the cons of Prometheus as a whole, but you can see that it goes to local storage. And then you can push alerts, right? Prometheus has an alert manager. So what it does is it monitors your data coming in, it can read from it, and then essentially you're pushing alerts out to things like OpsGenie, ServiceNow, Slack, Microsoft Teams. Wherever you really want to send that data and be alerted on, you can do it through Prometheus for the most part, right? You can also use custom webhooks. A lot of people will even funnel alerts to Jira, right? So you can do that kind of thing. And then you have visualization software. Logs.io is one of those vendors we visualize data for the most part. Grafana is also a very common tool. It's a great tool. So yeah, any questions about architecture real quick before we move on? Awesome. So let's do demo, right? Like, I'm kind of a nerd. I just like to do hands-on stuff. So, awesome. Okay. So the Cube Prometheus stack is really cool because it does a lot for you with one swoop, right? You don't have to install the operator. You don't have to install Grafana. You don't have to hook it all up. You don't have to run Prometheus as a whole. You don't have to run the alert manager, right? It does all of this for you in a Helm chart. So you can just add this repo directly in Helm and then install it. And what you get, and we'll do this by looking at the pods here. So can I run this, or you want me to blow it up a little bit? Okay, cool. So you see we have things like the alert manager, the Grafana running, Cube state metrics. And Cube state metrics is what's going to give us data about the actual Kubernetes workloads, right? Like, what is my deployment doing? What are my pods doing? What's the CPU percentage? What's the memory percentage? And I'm actually going to ask you guys, because I'm really curious if anyone actually monitors CPU, because I know it's a kind of debated topic. And then we got our node exporter, right? What are you actually getting from the host? So if you're running things like EC2 instances, right? Or what is Google's version of EC2? I forget the name of it. Is it GC? Compute Engine?
GCE.
GCE. Yeah, so things like that, right? You're going to get metrics like that, like the CPU seconds total, the disk space, right? All that. So that is what you get in terms of pods running. Now, how do you actually view Prometheus? How do you see this? How do you query it, right? What you can do is if you run kubectl get services, you're going to see that you actually get something called the alert manager operated, Prometheus Grafana, and the Prometheus, I believe it's Prometheus operated. So what we can do here is we can port forward. So if I'm doing this, right, this would be running Prometheus. So if I go to localhost 127 or 9090, right, if I run this, new tab, bang, right, we got Prometheus. Pretty cool, right? It's already up there. You don't have to go through all this work. So if we look at here, this little globe icon, you're going to see these are all of the metrics we get in. And we're going to talk a little bit about best practices because, listen, this is a lot of metrics. You can just keep scrolling, right? And really, what are you looking for at the end of the day? That's the big thing because, like I said, telemetry data is not cheap. So if you type in something like Cube, you'll get a lot of metrics that are relevant to tracking memory percentage, whether your pod's up, whether it's in a crashback loop, whether your node has memory pressure, whether it has disk pressure, right? And that's all calculated using PromQL, which I said, which is Prometheus's query language. I'm not going to talk about Prometheus's query language, actually the YouTube channel. I did a whole video on PromQL, 4 types of Prometheus metrics, everything. So if you guys want to check that out, I'm going to plug myself up, give it a watch. So yeah, this is essentially all the data that comes in, right? And then you also have your alert manager, which is separate, so we can port forward and also view the alert manager. But this is great and all, and you can visualize using Prometheus, but I really think a visualization tool helps and goes really far. because what you can't really do in Prometheus is you can query. So if we looked at, let's say, cube cluster allocated IPs, right? We get our Prometheus data, and we can see this, and we can start adding multiple graphs. We can see how this behaves over time. However, we're kind of limited in terms of functionality. You can keep adding charts, but then you start to run into issues, and it can kind of be annoying to all look at it from Prometheus's end. So that's what Grafana and something like Logs.io does, right? It allows you to see that data, create dashboards, create alerts, and just manage your data a heck of a lot easier. So let's look at Grafana, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to port forward Grafana to 8080, because that's the port that it runs on in the Prometheus stack. So if we go into that, see, I think I already have it up and running. Cool, yes, I already have it up and running. So you'll see here that the Cube Prometheus stack does something pretty cool for us. It gives us a lot of out-of-the-box alerts, so you don't have to write PromQL, right? That's kind of the good thing. I mean, it's good to know, and I think you should learn it. However, you get a lot of stuff out of the box, right? These are all rules. And you can see here, if we click on these, we're going to see that a lot of these are in healthy state, so we're not being alerted on them or anything, right? But you have things like the Cube CPU overcommit, the memory overcommit, the CPU quota. If you go into different folders, you'll get things like Cube state metrics list errors. You get a lot of data out of the box. Cube pod crash looping, right? Cube pod not ready. This is all very great. And then on top of that, what you also get is pre-installed dashboards. So when you run the Cube Prometheus stack, it gives you Grafana dashboards as well. So if we look at something like the compute resources on the cluster, look at that. You didn't really have to do anything. As long as we're running nodes, right? And we're running a cluster, we got a lot of data already out of the box. You don't have to configure a heck of a lot. Kind of does a lot of magic for you, which is great, right? So we get things like CPU utilization, CPU requests. If we want to change the data source, or if we wanted to create variables in Grafana, we could do that. If you guys want to nerd out about Grafana, I'm happy to after this. But essentially, yeah, right? So this is really what you get. A lot of stuff out of the box. And what's awesome about Grafana, I think, is that you, from an alerting perspective, you have your alert rules and contact points. So let's say you are a SRE team, maybe you have a DevOps team, platform engineering team, and you want to route alerts to different teams. What you can do is actually create something called a notification policy. So you see here that I have this notify Remy, which is, Remy's one of my dogs, and I have like a Slack endpoint that it goes to, right? So that's where it's forwarding my alerts, and it's based on this label notation, right? So notify equals Remy. And the way I hook that up to an alert specifically is if I go into one of these, and I don't have it set up, but, oh, actually I do for this one, right? So I have this label, notify Remy. So when this state goes into firing, what's going to happen is it's going to hit that notification policy and say, hey, there's a label, notifies Remy, send it to our Slack endpoint. And where you define that is in your contact points. So you can see here that I have this Slack endpoint in my contact points. So my notification policy says, well, the label for notifies Remy, go to that Slack notification endpoint. Yeah, it's going.
So I see we have alerts in Grafana that we're managing them from, but there's a separate alert manager component.
Yes, in Prometheus. Yes.
In like the architecture you showed us earlier.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Is this interfacing with that? Is it parallel to that?
Yeah, great question. I'm actually glad you asked that. So where all these alerts are actually coming from is, this is like look at Grafana as like the UI component to it. Like it kind of makes everything pretty, allows you to build dashboards. But what it does is it also brings in data sources. So if you go under connections in Grafana, you'll see Alert Manager, right? And you'll see Prometheus. So the connections where we're pulling the metrics from, Cube state metrics, nodes, exporters, and that's why you can query. And then you have the Alert Manager. So the only reason we have alerts in this alerting tab is because we're pulling in that data source, right? So we're getting those ones that are already pre-built for us. And honestly, if you want to add more, extend functionality, you can. So the Helm chart, and I think I'm going to put up a pull request because the documentation documentation kind of lacks on it, in my opinion. It's not intuitive. So what you see here, right, is like I created my own alert from, like this is an extension in my Helm values YAML. So if I want to push that up, I just run a Helm upgrade, and then it gets sent right up to the alert manager. I don't have to worry about like restarting pods, it just automatically does it. Because there actually is under the hood, I think it's like a Prometheus, I think part of the Prometheus operator is it actually does a reload for you. So you never have to worry about that.
So is it fair? That's a great question. I didn't think about it. So is it fair to say the alerts come from the alert manager, but you're just like seeing them as a GUI through the Grafana?
You can view it like that. It's tough because, okay, so there is a Prometheus alert manager and there's a Grafana alert manager. I know that seems confusing. So you can define alerts through Prometheus, like we just saw, or like the user see. And what you can also do is you can create alerts directly from Grafana too. So Prometheus, like in this case, we're pulling in Prometheus alerts that were defined. Grafana is kind of just like a GUI for it, right?
Okay.
And Grafana built its own capabilities on top of that, and they call it the Grafana Alert Manager, which pretty much extended the capabilities of Prometheus' Alert Manager. So I would say like Prometheus Alert Manager was probably like the OG version 1, and then Grafana was like, you know what, we're gonna make this thing our own, we're gonna make it better, it's gonna be more intuitive, right? So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Any other questions?
So Sean, when you put that extended the values YAML file,
Yeah.
is it a different way of adding the alert versus coming in here and
Yes.
manually adding it in?
Yes, yeah, definitely. So you can do it either way, right? You could do it from the values YAML, or you could do it directly in here. I think Grafana has a nice way of managing alerts. So like the more you create, you can do more with it, right? Grafana has some extended capabilities, but I still think you can do it from there. Yeah.
If Grafana's is so much better, why would we ever want to use the Prometheus one?
That's a good question. I honestly, I don't know. It might be preference, right? I think some people. Oh, well, I guess I could give you one thing. I mean, you're paying for resources to run Grafana, right? And you also have to think about, let's say you have multi regions, and you're running multiple clusters in different regions. Every time you spin up Prometheus, which we're going to talk about is kind of a scaling issue and a con to Prometheus, you have to run an instance every time. Like this is an open source Grafana, so it doesn't have like multi-tenancy and it doesn't bring everything together from all those sources. You have to run it individually. So you start scaling that out across how many clusters, nodes you have, that's gonna become more and more expensive. So it's just another resource you have to add. So I think that, like, to answer your question, I don't know, personally, I would take the sacrifice, and I think a GUI is nice. But I'm sure there's people that are like, no, I don't like Grafana, I want to use Prometheus, right? I don't know.
Have you used Grafana's Mimir, which is the multi-tenant Prometheus?
No, no, I have not. Is it cool?
It's interesting. There's a lot of quirks like this.
A lot of quirks.
I personally hate the UI of this alerting page, the new next generation alerts.
You're right. I think there's still a long way to go, right? Like, I think that UIs, when it comes to observability, they lack a lot, and they're not easy. That's the issue. Like I said, we have 3 telemetry types. We have logs, metrics, and traces. They don't play nice together. They're all different formats, right? You have logs that are plain text coming from Nginx servers, you have, or whatever, right? Network devices. Then you have metrics that are Prometheus formatted. You have traces that look completely different from OpenTelemetry. So you're trying to build a UI that combines all of these, and it's really, really tough. Really tough, right? So I think this Grafana has a good solution. However, there's cons. Yeah.
There's another component behind all this, the InfluxDB, right?
Ah, yes. Influx.
Is that what's being used here?
No. So InfluxDB is a separate service.
Okay.
So InfluxDB is Influx its own company? I think it is, right? Yeah. So Influx, I think, works a little bit different than Prometheus. I made a video about the rate function. Rate function is really cool, what it does and how it handles counter metrics in Prometheus. I think you guys should definitely check it out, because if you're tracking things like CPU percentage total or CPU seconds total and it drops down to 0, it has a way of like making an inference and meaning like, oh, we know this was a restart, let's continue to count on. It's really cool, but InfluxDB doesn't do something like that. So there's pros and cons to it.
On that diagram, you show the database,
Yeah,
right?
I can go back to it.
But what is that in this case? What is?
Oh gosh, no, I'm with my dogs. Sorry guys. I'm not good with slides.
Is it just local storage meaning is
Local storage is Prometheus' local storage, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that. So, you jumped the gun. No, I'm kidding.
sorry.
No. Don't be sorry. I'm kidding. I would rather have this be an open discussion. Anyways. So, we'll talk a little bit about best practices, and I'll get to some of the scaling stuff, and that's talked about, right? So, best practices. Cool. So, reducing labels and cardinality. Has anyone ran into issues with cardinality? Yeah, you. Yeah, you're my man tonight. You just got it. You're running into issues. So, okay, so reducing labels and cardinality. The more labels you have, the more metrics and unique metrics are going to be created. This is expensive from a storage perspective, a resource perspective on your nodes, wherever you're running Prometheus, and CPU, right? So you really want to cut down on that, and it also can become really annoying. The more time series you have to sift out that data and be like, oh, what do I aggregate by? Is this the right label I should be aggregating by? And honestly, a lot of times you don't need a lot of them. You can kind of roll them up. So I would say be cautious about that when running Prometheus. Try to cut down cardinality, which is just variance, right? Push gateway. Push gateway is used for short-lived jobs. So if you have like a service level bash, right, or you're deleting a bunch of users, that might be something that's really short-lived. But you don't necessarily, Prometheus has a scrape interval. So what it does is it hits your targets and it says, every 15 seconds scrape this metric. But if it's a short-lived job, right, it might miss that scrape and return no data. So then you're like, well, wait, I had something. I should have got a metric in, but now I'm not. So that's what the push gateway really does. Kind of enables you to perform metrics on short-lived jobs. And then the big thing, and I run into this daily with my customers, is understand metrics coming from your exporter. So there's a ton of exporters out there for different technologies, right? But everything in all telemetry data is not the same. So what you run into is maybe on one exporter you have something being tracked in seconds, and then one is milliseconds, and one is nanoseconds, depending on the metric, right? And then you're doing calculations on these, and you're like, this doesn't make sense. I'm multiplying this by 100 or whatever, and it's not giving me the right value. It's because sometimes they have different units of measurement, and metrics, I don't know why, there's no universal language when it comes to metrics. I wish there was, but it's not, right? So, yeah, they're all not created equal. Be careful about it. Cool. So scaling Prometheus challenges. Retention, right? Prometheus wasn't built for long-term storage. So you can configure this, and it adds a level of complexity. You can definitely do things with Prometheus in terms of retention. So you can extend that out, right? But it kind of lacks that functionality, and it wasn't built for that. So you have things like, anyone hear of Thanos? Anyone ever heard of Thanos? Yeah. So Thanos is kind of a play to that and a solution to that, right? So there's a lot of benefits of Thanos, and that's a whole different talk. We can get to that one. But Thanos is out there to solve that. Same with high availability, right? To be available, multiple instances of Prometheus need to be deployed. So like I was mentioning earlier, if you're running multiple clusters across different regions, right, you're gonna have to deploy Prometheus on each one of those. And there's something called federation in Prometheus, which allows you to grab metrics from multiple areas and hit an endpoint, and it kind of unifies the data. I think you were saying with Mimir, right? It probably does something relatively similar. I assume in some regard.
Yeah, Mimir is based on the Cortex platform, which is the competitor.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm actually just starting to learn about Cortex.
Yeah.
Cortex is really cool. So yeah, it wasn't really like built for that, right? It runs kind of like on a single node in terms of Prometheus. So how do you really resolve that issue? I think once again, I think Thanos is kind of out to solve that. Cortex, right? Federation kind of helps with that. But the problem with Federation, and that's Prometheus's like proprietary solution to that issue, is it adds just more and more complexity. You have to start to manage those config files, and it can become super resource exhausting. And same with multi-tenancy, right? So, with that being said, I think I think the big thing that I see and we see at Logs.io is like how do we solve the retention and how do we solve kind of the federation, right? Like this is a lot for engineers to be managing on a day-to-day basis sometimes. Like most of the time people just want to be able to see things, get alerted on it, and not have to worry about it, and that's kind of where managed services come into play, like something like Logs.io, something like Splunk, Datadog, right? Like these solutions solve that problem. But with that being said, open source is great. I'm a huge open source ambassador, I love it. And then this is kind of just some few architecture that I actually put Cortex up in the top right. So this is kind of what you would see, right? Like this is a Thanos version of it. Don't ask me to make sense of these. I just throw them up there because I figured like smarter people than me might understand them. But really, Thanos and Cortex and Victoria metrics are kind of out to solve some of the scaling issues that I just mentioned. And then resources. So I found a couple of good resources out there. The internet's a wild place. You have to sift through a lot of crap sometimes. But I found some good ones on multi-tenant capabilities. Code Cloud's a really good resource. I'm taking a course right now. I'm trying to become Prometheus certified, whatever that means. How to downsampling and managing cardinality, right? Like we're talking about with labels. And then just challenges with running Prometheus at scale. So there's way more than what I put here, but this kind of gives you a little bit about my talk. Cool, that's it, guys. That's all I get.
So is Thanos part of Prometheus?
It's an extension. You actually can. So the cool thing about going back to the Q Prometheus stack, it actually has support for Thanos. It's an optional configuration, but you can actually run it along with it. So sometimes I think a lot of people run Thanos as a sidecar container next to Prometheus. But essentially what you can do is configure it yourself through, I think there's a custom resource definition. So yeah, you can definitely do that. What's up?
Do you see any sort of playing between OpenTelemetry and Prometheus? Do you see any sort of people scraping metrics from Prometheus using OpenTelemetry or pumping stuff into Prometheus from OpenTelemetry? How do you see that work?
Starting to see that more and more. Who uses OpenTelemetry right now? You guys like it? Yeah, you do. Yeah. So OpenTelemetry, I think, is definitely the next evolution of consolidating telemetry types. Right? I think it's still a little early. I don't think the metric solution's all that great. The logging just got there, and then tracing, I think it still has some work ahead of it. But I think to answer your question, yeah, I definitely see people using OpenTelemetry more and more, and I think it's only going to get more and more popular, right? Like these CNCF backed projects are really getting some leverage now. So I think the fact that Prometheus and OpenTelemetry are both in that environment, they're just going to become better and better. Cool, nothing else? Okay, no, I'm just kidding. Awesome, thanks guys, I appreciate it.
All right, guys.